Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are continuing our study, our refutation of Mr. Sam Frost's book, The Parousia of the Son of Man. And as I mentioned to you last week, I just simply cannot cover all of the error found in this book. And I'm not trying to be unkind. But virtually every paragraph in this book contains major error. There is sleight of hand of wording. There are presuppositions. There is just simply bad logic. There is an abuse of exegesis and hermeneutic. Those are just the facts. I'm sorry. You cannot read this book without being amazed at how bad it is. As an example of that, now in last video, I shared with you some of Mr. Frost's thoughts and claims about Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse. And I must say, once again, that I'm just literally stunned at some of the claims that he makes. Now, make no mistake, Matthew chapter 24 has been a cause of consternation and discussion among Bible students like forever. That is undoubtedly true. And so Mr. Frost sets out to show to us that Matthew chapter 24 is about two things. This is not new. He sets out to prove to us, well, technically he sets out to prove three things, but nonetheless, he sets out to prove that when the disciples asked, "Tell us when shall these things be?" That's the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And what shall be the sign of your coming, your parousia? Well, that parousia is his ascension, ostensibly, in Acts chapter 1. So please catch the power of this. The disciples are supposedly asking for a sign of Jesus' ascension that happened in Acts chapter 1. Now notice, the text does not say, what shall be the sign that you ascended? What shall be the sign of your parousia? What shall be the sign that it's about to happen? After all, they're asking for a sign of the end of the age, when it will happen. So the language does not allow us to say, okay, show us a sign that you've already ascended, and then show us a sign of when the end of the age will come. So that just changes the language completely. But all of that aside, Mr. Frost says, and I'm on page 32. I have to read a good bit here. Even in their own day, they would see the Roman armies and their massive legions gathering for war against the Jews, and also persecuting the Christians, who were also persecuted by many of their fellow Jews. Such is the description of the tribulations to come. Now catch this. Great tribulations, as witnessed in the war of the Jews with the Romans that lasted 66 to 73, and in 114 and 135 Christian era. The temple of Herod was razed as the nation of Rome was against the nation of Israel, but this is not the end, ho telos. The end is not yet, Matthew 24 and verse 6. Now, keep in mind, the disciples have asked about a sign of the end of the ages. And Jesus said, after giving some initial signs, the end, singular, is not yet. But then he said when the gospel would be preached into all of the world, then comes the end, singular. So the end, the consummative end, would come after the preaching of the gospel. You just got to hang on to that. Anyway, such is the descriptions of that which would and does characterize the soon telia of the age, leading up to the ho telos, when heaven and earth itself would pass away. The advent of Christ, the one sent from heaven, and the coming one who ascended into heaven to now be present before the Father, renders his justice and rewards on earth to those who are obedient to him and to those who are not obedient to him. The world must continue on for an indefinite time because the angels are sent from heaven by the Son of Man to gather them into this fold to the wedding supper. Such is the meaning of parousia in Matthew. So, for Mr. Frost, parousia is not just the ascension into heaven of Acts chapter 1. It is the advent. See, he changes the word. He changes the wording. Such is the advent at the end of the age. Now, once again, notice his use of the singular, the end. Will I continue? Thus, Matthew 24, 4-14 encompasses, please catch the power of this, the entirety of the gospel enterprise in the world from the first century to the end. When the heavens and the earth shall pass away, Matthew 24:35, of which no man knows that day, it is an indefinite period of time. Verses 15-20 mark the specific time in their own day when Jerusalem will be sacked and the temple burned, answering the aspect of their question as to when shall these things or these buildings will be destroyed. So, the disciples asked about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and Mr. Frost tells us that verses 15-20, that's it. Verses 15-20 describe that time. Wow. Okay, however, in verse 21, Jesus denotes that great tribulation will continue throughout until there is no more tribulation, for immediately after the tribulation of those days, the heavens and earth will dissolve and pass away. Great tribulation marks the whole period, or the whole of time to the end. It is not a one-time specific period as popularly denoted today. Those days are marked by the fact that unless they were cut short, meaning they will come to an end, no flesh would be saved. These great tribulations of wars, earthquakes, famines, pestilence, death, and trial will not continue forever. They are cut short until the elect are called. Matthew 24, verse 22. It is the elect that are saved throughout tribulation as the gospel goes forth in the nations, in the generations to come. More word games. In the world you will have tribulation, through many tribulations to enter the kingdom. Tribulation is the vehicle through which faith and hope are carved out in the life of the believer. The one who believes or endures to their end of life shall be saved. Matthew 24:13. Entering the kingdom of God upon death, awaiting with all the saints the resurrection in the last days. Look, I've got to tell you, I could make 10 videos on all the error contained in these two paragraphs. But let's talk about the Great Tribulation. Mr. Frost is claiming that the Great Tribulation began in the first century and continues until the annihilation of the world. Well, point number one, that violates Matthew 24 and verse 34, when Jesus, speaking about all of those signs, and remember, the Great Tribulation is a sign of the end. Just like the preaching of the gospel into all the world was a sign of the end. But wait, the preaching of the gospel into all the world occurred in the first century, as we've proven unequivocally. Okay, and yet here we have the preaching of the gospel into all of the world accomplished in the first century, which meant the end was supposed to come then. And yet Mr. Frost turns around and says, no, the Great Tribulation endures for the entirety of the Christian age. Oh, by the way, did you notice that Mr. Frost refuses to call it the Christian age or the gospel age or the new covenant age? You know why? Because he knows that the new covenant age of Jesus Christ has no end. Matthew 24, verse 35. We'll be talking about that passage an awful lot. So, Mr. Frost says the Great Tribulation lasts for the entirety of the, quote, gospel enterprise from the first century until the annihilation of the world. Well, next point, the world will never be destroyed. Do you realize that many world-class scholars teach us, and by the way, none of them are preterists, and we're talking about N.T. Wright, David Nanos, R.T. France, Perryman, Holland. I mean, on and on I could go. R.T. France. They all teach us that the Jews did not believe in the annihilation of the world. Next point. Once again, Mr. Frost says the Great Tribulation would endure throughout the entirety of the gospel enterprise. Well, let's see. In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, Daniel says at that time, now keep in mind, Mr. Frost says at that time refers to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. That's in the 2nd century BC. At that time there shall be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world, nor ever yet shall be. Well, wait a minute. Mr. Frost must of necessity have the Great Tribulation beginning in the 2nd century BC and extending all the way to the, quote, end of the world, unquote. Oh, but wait. That means that the real abomination of desolation must have occurred then. You know what? Mr. Frost claims that it did. Mr. Frost denies that that the abomination of desolation occurred in the 1st century. Well, that means that the man of sin didn't live in the 1st century, but that raises another entire issue that we're going to be examining later on. And Mr. Frost, absolutely unprecedented, unparalleled, unbelievable claim about the man of sin. But you see, the bottom line is, Paul believed that the spirit of lawlessness was already at work. The man of sin was already being restrained in the 1st century. But you see, Jesus said, when you see. Now, he said, when you see the abomination of desolation. He was speaking to living, breathing human beings and said they would see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. Now, Mr. Frost wants us to believe, well, what that means is, when you see something that reminds you of what happened in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, you're not going to really see the abomination of desolation. You're just going to see something that will remind you of the abomination of desolation. Unfortunately, that's not what the text says. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let those in Judea flee. If they were not to see the abomination of desolation, why would they have to flee? When you see, flee. When you see the abomination foretold by Daniel, let the reader understand. Flee from Judea. And remember, Jesus said, verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. Now, of course, unfortunately, Mr. Frost has decided to do more verbal and linguistic gymnastics on this generation. We'll talk about that at a later time. But you see, what Jesus sets forth is not a panoramic view of the entirety of the Christian age. Until the end of the Christian age has no end. The preaching of the gospel is the unending task of the church after the end of the age. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 7. But the gospel was preached into all the world as a witness to the nations, and the end was to occur then. The Great Tribulation sprang from the abomination of desolation. And Jesus said his living, breathing apostles would see that abomination. He did not say, well, you know, you're going to see something that roughly resembles what happened almost 300 years ago. So when you realize that, you need to get out of town, because that's going to be the beginning of 2,000 years of the greatest tribulation that the world has ever seen. Look, folks, no one that knows anything about world history can describe the Christian age, or Mr. Frost's term, the gospel enterprise. No one who knows anything about world history can describe the gospel enterprise and the last 2,000 years since the preaching of the gospel into all the world in the first century and call it the greatest tribulation that the world has ever seen. Anyone making that claim is ignoring world history up to the time of Jesus. It is really and honestly a travesty to make that claim. Okay, I'm out of time for the day. Gone longer than I wanted to, but that's okay. Thank you for joining me for this morning's morning musings. Have a safe weekend. Hope to see you on Monday.